Something we've repeatedly seen with Ukraine is that the narrative can sometimes swing faster than the battlefield reality. Some on the internet might describe this as the "it's so over" to "we're so back" cycle, and it's often been major, very public events generating that swing in reporting. Whether that's a surge in pro-Ukrainian optimism after events like the Kharkiv Offensive, Prigozhin's mutiny, or Operation Spider's Web, or swings in the other direction after the fall of well-known positions like Bakhmut or Avdiivka. So far as those major public events go, it's hard to get more public than the Russian Victory Day parade. Historically an opportunity for Moscow to parade its arsenal of advanced military systems and demonstrate power and clout on the international stage. In 2025, that meant something like 200 vehicles and aircraft rolling through or over Red Square, while leaders or senior representatives of the better part of 30 nations attended to see Russia show off some of its more advanced kit. Jump forward to this month, and the advanced tanks, surface-to-air missile launchers and nuclear delivery systems were once again present, just on giant screens. Even many traditional Russian allies stayed away, as stated fears of Ukrainian drone attacks on the Russian capital saw the parade downscaled, internet access restricted, and Moscow actually reach out to Kyiv for a temporary ceasefire, one that Ukraine eventually granted, on the condition that Russia agreed to a large-scale POW exchange. Between the somewhat lacklustre parade and reported Russian difficulties on the battlefield, publisher after publisher appears to have rolled out articles asking if Ukraine has now turned the tide. And so today, just as many other times where the public narrative has shifted, I want to dig into what the evidence actually has to say about that, looking both at some reasons to be optimistic about Ukraine's battlefield fortunes in 2026, but also some of the risks and pressures that are still shoving in the other direction. Given how complicated even a superficially simple question like how is the war going can get, what I've decided to do is to split this episode into two parts. Today, I'll start by looking briefly at the parade ceasefire and its implications, and then get on to the battlefield and forces side of things, including Russian force generation, frontline movements, and one major example of the battlefield tech race where things at the moment are looking better for Ukraine. That'll then leave the door open to pivot to bigger picture issues like economics, long-range strike, and politics and diplomacy in the coming weeks. For now though, let's head to Moscow to ask a simple question. Why, in the middle of an actual war, might people be talking about a parade, and what happened? As most of you know, the annual Victory Day parade celebrating the Soviet victory over Germany during the Second World War is usually considered one of the major national holidays and events in Russia. As such, it has deep political, diplomatic, and information warfare significance. As I've stressed in the past, the war in Ukraine isn't just about actual battlefield outcomes, it's about perceptions. If Russia can project an image of military strength and confidence and international support, then that may well impact Russian attitudes towards the war and Putin's government, as well as the international opinions and expectations that are so critical to determining how this all ends. Arguments that countries shouldn't provide military assistance to Ukraine, because a Russian military victory is inevitable anyway, depends on people believing that Russia is inevitably going to win. Russia's push for Ukraine to hand over the Donbass because they're going to take it anyway, likewise benefits from convincing other powers that Russia will in fact take it. Basically, there are very real strategic reasons that if you were the Russian government, you'd want to look strong for the cameras. That alone would have made the level of downscaling we saw compared to previous years interesting. Russia cut the ground vehicles typically involved in the parade, and also significantly cut down the number of troops participating. Meanwhile, security was tightened with internet access limited, the number of foreign journalists tightly controlled, and the contingent of foreign leaders present reduced to a fraction of previous years. Before we even start asking if any of that matters though, we first need to try and understand the why. Fortunately this year, unlike previous ones, we don't really have to guess, because this year one Russian source decided to basically say the quiet part out loud, with Vladimir Putin quoted in Russian state media saying that the parade took place without military equipment, quote, not only for security reasons, but primarily because the armed forces must focus their attention on the final defeat of the enemy in the special military operation, end quote. That is, if we're willing to take Putin at his word, he's suggesting Russia wasn't showing off as much equipment or as many troops this year because it needed to focus resources on Ukraine. If you accepted that though, it raises some very interesting comparisons to previous years. In May 2023, Russia wasn't exactly in a fantastic position in Ukraine. 2022 had seen major successful Ukrainian offensives at Kharkiv and Kherson. Russia had been forced to declare a partial mobilization, and just about everyone expected a major Ukrainian offensive to kick off in Zaporizhia any time now. The Ukrainian military had literally released trailers for the event, the Russian military had rapidly built up the Surovikin line, and so you can imagine that the military imperative not to divert valuable assets to the parade was probably very, very high. That said, Russia decided it was still worth holding a parade, and it was still important to parade equipment. A lot of stuff that might be useful at the front wasn't shown off. The only tank present was a single T-34-85, for example. But Russia compensated and maintained the spectacle by rolling out a lot of material that wasn't exactly needed in the trenches. ICBM TELs, for example, from the Strategic Rocket Forces, or infantry mobility vehicles. Meaning, even at a comparative military low point, Russia was still able to show off some military spectacle. In 2024, the military position for Russia was arguably better in Ukraine, and that correlated with the scale up in the parade. The tankers still only brought a single T-34, but there were plenty of vehicles on the ground and the flyover in the air. And then for the 80th anniversary of the end of the Great Patriotic War in 2025, Russia turned it up about 4 notches. If you hadn't been following events and had nothing to go on but the footage, at this point you might have guessed that Russia had actually won in Ukraine. They rolled out entire groups of T-90M tanks, for example, one of Russia's most upgraded and capable models. You can imagine some of the blokes operating older T-72s or T-62s in Ukraine probably would have preferred to be driving rather than watching on TV. Despite Ukraine having demonstrated the ability to reach as far as Moscow or beyond with its drones, the scale was lavish and the international involvement significant. A contingent from the People's Liberation Army participated, for example, marching across Red Square, arguably as much a symbol of the times as back in 2010, when in a pre-Crimea context, parade participants had included the US, UK, France, and Poland. For comparison, 2010 had seen around 50 global leaders attend the parade. In 2025, it was closer to 30. There were plenty of smaller powers. Maduro attended for Venezuela, for example, but India sent its defence minister, countries like Egypt and China sent their presidents, and there was even one EU leader present, Slovakian Prime Minister Fico. The reason I bring all this up is that even once you account for 2025 being a major anniversary, the overall trend was that the longer the war in Ukraine went on, the closer and closer Russia's military parades looked to normal. More troops and equipment being dedicated for parade duty, and more international attendees. In 2026, that all took a hairpin turn. You didn't have Chinese troops participating in the parade this time, but you did have North Koreans, acknowledging their contribution to the war in Ukraine, which, remember, for a while, some had denied was actually happening. International participation was way down, and that solo T-34 was looking very, very lonely on the parade route. I also think if you dig into the two Russian stated concerns, security and the need to focus resources on Ukraine, the first one in particular raises a couple of questions, namely, what security concerns? I think the argument you might not want to expose things like ICBM launches to a potential Ukrainian attack is fairly intuitive, but it's kind of hard to imagine the presence of a couple of infantry mobility vehicles or a tank or two would really represent the kind of strategic targets that might make or break a Ukrainian decision to attack the parade or not. If Ukraine's grand plan in all this was to knock out a couple of Russian tanks or surface-to-air missile systems, they'd hardly need to travel to Moscow to find them. And if the goal was just to launch a symbolic or disruptive attack for propaganda purposes, then the amount of equipment that could be targeted would be almost irrelevant. It's hard to imagine Russia as a propaganda strategy, arguing that, sure, Ukraine was able to launch a drone attack on the parade, but they didn't destroy any tanks, so everything is okay. From a military perspective, you still had a lot of troops present. And also, if you're talking about Russia's real security priorities, you also had a major potential Ukrainian target that was always going to be present, Vladimir Putin. And given the Ukrainian drone threat very much existed in 2025, albeit on a slightly different scale, I think it's hard to suggest that the only driver here would be limiting the number of available Ukrainian targets. To me then, that might suggest that some of the other factors were coming into play with this decision. Or perhaps the military imperative not to pull units and equipment to Moscow to prepare for the parade and then carry it out were more acute and compelling than they were even back in 2023. Either way, Russia appears to have tried to fortify its security planning for the event by getting the Ukrainians to agree to a short-term ceasefire. That led to the somewhat public spectacle of Zelensky publishing a note, ostensibly granting permission for the parade to take place in Moscow. It's worth noting that other than temporarily ruling out long-range strikes, this didn't really look like a ceasefire in a traditional sense. Fighting temporarily slowed along many areas of the front, but it never stopped. And given that immediately after the ceasefire ended, Russia launched a record-breaking drone and missile attack on Ukraine, it sure looks like what Russia effectively did was save up the munitions it otherwise would have launched during the ceasefire, and then just let rip with most of them as soon as it was over. Something to keep in mind, one might suggest, just in case the ceasefire in the Middle East falls apart and air missile and drone attacks resume. For their part, in exchange for Moscow gaining a couple of days of guaranteed quiet, the Ukrainians got a brief respite of their own, a 1,000 for 1,000 POW swap, and a comparatively easy win in the information game, one which seems to have immediately paid off with some of those articles we mentioned question Russia's military status and whether it still had the momentum in Ukraine. For our part then, I certainly think the parade and the Russian ceasefire request is a useful data point, especially when you compare it to previous years like 2023 or 2024, but it's just one data point. And so what I want to do now is pivot to a couple of indicators that go a lot deeper than a single act of military choreography, asking where the data suggests Ukraine might now have some reasons for optimism, and also where there's still clearly risks and warning signs. Which gets us to potential reason for optimism number one that I've seen surface in a lot of the recent reporting. To maintain an advantage in this very attritional style of fighting, Russia has traditionally leveraged a major edge over the Ukrainians when it comes to force generation and regeneration, which is a technical way of saying that Russia is a bigger country with more people and more stuff, and has so normally been better placed to absorb losses and continue expanding the military, even as professional drone catcher has become more and more common as a military career path. What some of the coverage out of the media has recently been suggesting, though, is that in recent months the basic equation of Russian military regeneration, manpower in exceeding manpower out, has now potentially tipped, with the Russians claim to be losing more personnel than they're recruiting. Now, as I've said in the past, assessing casualties with certainty is a much more difficult exercise than heavy equipment. Visual confirmations are more difficult and proportionally rarer and highly sensitive to assumptions. If you see a dugout struck, for example, it's hard to make assumptions about how many people were in there and whether they were killed, wounded, or just lightly rattled. For what it's worth, the claimed numbers here go something like this. The Ukrainians claim that between December 2025 and April 2026, the Russians mobilised or recruited about 148,000 personnel, while losses inflicted by the Ukrainians totaled about 156,000, with claimed losses in March and April averaging about 34,000 a month. That's relatively close to the average rate of recruitment claimed by the Russians for 2025, with Medvedev giving a number of 422,000 people having signed contracts in 2025, which was mildly down from the 450,000 in 2024, but still about 35,000 a month. Account for the fact that recruiting rates month to month are often uneven, and you can see the basis of the Ukrainian claim that Russians have recently been in the red. Now, if our primary goal here was trying to determine exact numbers, there's a couple of routes we could go down. Obituaries, budget figures, and a couple of data sources we've looked at before. But for this episode, I actually want to introduce a new indicator that's a bit less dependent on the numbers being claimed. Let's talk about Russian force structure. Let me explain. A number of times over the course of this war, beginning in 2022, Russia has made announcements increasing the maximum authorised strength of the Russian military, as well as the intention to create new units or expand existing ones out of all of those additional personnel. I have one example on the right there that shows that general pattern. In December 2023, Putin announced that he would increase the maximum authorised strength of the Russian military by about 170,000 to 1.32 million. Then, just a few months later, Defence Minister Shoigu announced that the Russian military would, over the course of 2024, create 2 new combined arms armies, consisting of no fewer than 14 divisions and 16 brigades, totalling, according to Russian sources, you guessed it, about 170,000 personnel. Now, given 170,000 is far fewer than Russia was believed to be recruiting at the time, the Russian intention appears to be that a proportion of new recruits would go to replacing losses and rebuilding existing units, while 170,000 extras could be dedicated to creating these new ones. The problem, of course, is that that math only works if the gap between personnel inflows and outflows is actually at least 170,000. If your inflow for the year is 450,000 and you want to divert 170 of those into new formations without weakening your existing ones, you need your total outflows, including casualties, to be less than 280,000. Meanwhile, if casualties were actually higher than that, they might be forced to put some of these efforts on the back burner in order to patch holes in existing units instead, which is exactly what we saw the manpower-challenged Ukrainians do in 2025 when they said they'd stop creating new brigades and instead focus on strengthening existing ones and transitioning over to the core system. So, now that we have our proxy measure, how did the Russians go on force generation in 2025? Special credit here to Rob Lee and Ukrainian Marine Dmytro Putiata, who actually went through and reconciled Russian force generation goals for 2025 against what we actually ended up seeing. For those of you who are interested in a little more detail, I'll link their write-up in the description. What they found is a Russian plan for 2025 that came at the force generation problem for a couple of angles. Firstly, they wanted to create a number of entirely new formations. Then they wanted to take a number of existing brigades, including some of the more successful ones, and bulk those out into divisions. 200th Arctic Motor Rifle Brigade, for example, was meant to become 71st Motor Rifle Division. Multiple other motor rifle brigades were set to be built out to division strength, and 2 naval infantry brigades, the 155th and 336th, were meant to become naval infantry divisions, that being the 55th and 120th respectively. That's not an exhaustive list, but you get the idea. There were also meant to be some higher level formations getting the whole bulking out treatment. 3 Army Corps, for example, 11th, 14th and 44th, were meant to make the jump to combined arms armies. In total, the authors found a stated intention to create or enlarge 19 significant units in 2025. If Russian personnel inflows had significantly exceeded outflows, it might be safe to assume that all of those changes would have happened, and some of them did. The Arctic troops, the 200th Motor Rifle Brigade, for example, were reformed in June 2025 into the 71st Guards Motor Rifle Division. But a lot of these on-paper plans appear to have stayed just that, paper plans. And the vast majority of the brigades that were meant to level up the division are still brigades. Of the 19 major raisings, expansions or reorganisations the authors identified, they evaluated 4 as having been successfully implemented, 1 partially implemented, and the rest, well, you can see that red bar there. In total, Russia itself in the end only claimed the formation of 5 divisions in 2025. And even within that 5, there appears to be a bit of nuance and maybe some creative accounting. To demonstrate what I mean, let's look at just one of the naval infantry units. 2 of these were meant to be upgraded from brigade to division, 155th and 336th, but I'm going to focus just on one of the 2, the Pacific Fleet's 155th Guards Naval Infantry Brigade. One stereotype I've tried to push back on, which I think was particularly prevalent in the earlier phase of the war, is this very strange assertion that all Russian formations, all Russian troops are of low quality. As far as the data goes, that isn't and has never been true. Both the Russian and Ukrainian militaries have a wide variance in terms of quality, and so you inevitably have your units who are better trained, better equipped, and more capable, versus those that perhaps aren't operating on the same tier. If you had a combat value hierarchy for Russian infantry then, especially early in the war, the naval infantry got a reputation for being near the top. A lot of the images we have of these troops, especially early in the war, show comparatively good individual kit compared to a lot of the rest of the Russian force, and Ukrainians and Western observers generally valued them more than other Russian troops. One Ukrainian soldier I spoke to back in 2023, for example, described the experience of fighting different types of Russian troops, some of whom he described as demoralised and borderline useless, and others skilled, determined and dangerous. Naval infantry like the 155th fell into that latter category. In the military, as in so many career fields, however, having a reputation for being good at your job can be a bit of a double-edged sword. If you prove you can do the hard, shitty jobs, you might tend to get assigned the hard, shitty jobs. We've seen that on the Ukrainian side with some of the more capable units shuffled across the front in a firefighting role, while on the Russian side it often meant that the same units were time and time again chosen to lead offensive actions, while less capable ones filled more standard battlefield duties. What that meant for the 155th is that they turned up in the open source tracking everywhere, and we got to see the unit get chewed up again and again and again. They were in Chernihiv earlier in the war, then Volodar where they got the full General Muratov treatment, and after Ukraine launched its offensive there, they also fought in Kursk. Across those battles, the unit appears to have taken heavy losses on multiple occasions and had to be repeatedly reconstituted. Just for the Volodar campaign, Mediazona was able to look at obituaries and confirm more than 200 dead Marines from the 155th, as well as an additional 50 plus missing. Account for other elements like the seriously wounded, and their estimate was a roughly 40% loss against pre-war strength for the 2 naval infantry brigades engaged. The estimates for the Kursk campaign are less precise, but appearing to lose their brigade commander to a HIMARS strike probably isn't a great sign for the experience of the rest of the unit. And so I bring them up here as a litmus test for 2 reasons. One, based on the way they've been used in the past, this seems to be a unit the Russians consider a high priority. So if resources were scarce, you'd expect them to be fairly high up the priority list. That links to point 2, which is in previous years, the Russians have repeatedly been able to rebuild the 155th. A unit which was badly bloodied in the north was rebuilt fast enough to be badly bloodied in the south, only to rebuild again enough to make a major contribution in Kursk, which makes it all the more interesting that the expansion of the 155th and the 336th doesn't really appear to have gone to plan. Unlike most of the units in the expansion plan, at least the naval infantry brigades were redesignated divisions. The 155th Brigade became the 55th Division, and the 336th the 120th. But according to the report, this seems to have been the military equivalent to a promotion without the paycheck, with the authors noting that both of these nominal divisions, quote, only have 1 naval infantry regiment, so they're still approximately brigade size. With the authors going on to estimate the 120th Naval Infantry Division currently has approximately 4,500 personnel, which would make it a division with about as many personnel as, you guessed it, an American brigade. Now, despite Russia falling well short on many of these new and expanded units in 2025, officially, they still have a pretty long list of plans for 2026 to add to the existing backlog. According to the report, more than 10 brigades are meant to become divisions, 1 division is meant to become a corps, some battalions are meant to become brigades, and a number of entirely new formations put together as well. If nothing else, that suggests a degree of organisational confidence from the Russian perspective, and if it was all to come to pass as planned, it would be a deeply unwelcome development for the Ukrainians. But based on what we saw in 2025, Russia's ability to actually do any of their stuff should probably be held in doubt, especially if you assume that most of the new personnel inflow has to go towards rebuilding and maintaining existing units, not expanding or creating new ones. From a Ukrainian perspective, even that alone might be a reason for optimism, Because you have to imagine it's going to be more difficult for Russia to maintain or build momentum if it can't expand the force. That said, there are a couple of countervailing points here. Russian manpower and force generation challenges don't exist in a vacuum, they have to be compared to Ukraine's. And while the Ukrainians may not be suffering as many casualties as the Russians, they're also bringing fewer new troops into uniform every month. That means, depending on their own force status, keeping the Russian force at a relatively constant manpower level may or may not actually be sufficient. Meanwhile, Ukrainian commanders publicly remained very concerned about Russian mobilization potential. Syrskyi recently said, for example, that Russia still has millions of people in its population with some military training who could potentially be called up, meaning Russia's ability to bulk out its force is in some ways as much an economic and political question as it is a military one. The people are there, but so far, the Kremlin hasn't been willing to pay the economic or political price to get them. According to Russian leaders, the country is already facing a labour shortage, and so pulling hundreds of thousands of additional men out of the workforce suddenly obviously wouldn't come without costs. And if the political trade-offs of an additional mobilisation were easy to make, one imagines the Kremlin would have hit the infantry spam button before now. The point is more that the Ukrainians can't control whether or not the Russians solve this issue. All they can do is keep the price high and disincentivise the Kremlin from doing so. There is also one massive exception to Russian force generation challenges that perhaps explains some of the other ones. While some traditional military units appear to have been struggling to get manpower, the new Russian unmanned systems forces have been growing incredibly quickly. According to the Ukrainians, this force that, remember, not that long ago did not exist, reached a manning level of 87,000 personnel in early 2026, and recently has built up to cross the 100,000 mark. Just as with the Ukrainian USF, some of that Russian figure has come from recruitment or transfers from other parts of the military. But the core point here is the Russian MOD still has manpower to work with, just not so much that it can get away without prioritising, even at the expense of historically high-priority units. That also links to another element that I think might give the Ukrainians reason for some cautious optimism. When you're comparing these two militaries, you obviously have the ongoing battlefield clash, but you also have a race in the rear areas as well. The question of not just how well does both sides mobilise and allocate its resources, but how quickly and effectively they're able to reform. This is a very tech-heavy and rapidly changing war, and so one way to get the advantage is to adapt and modernise your force more rapidly than the other guy. In 2024, I'd argue Russia got a bit of a boost here when long-term Defence Minister Sergei Shoigu was finally benched and a new face brought in. Andrei Removich Belousov studied economics and was the former Russian Minister for Economic Development, whereas our mate Sergei had received a letter of thanks from the Ukrainians for the immense amount of damage he'd done to the Russian military by allowing corruption to fester for years. Belousov almost immediately made changes to the Russian war economy and also to the military itself. One of his first acts, for example, was to establish Rubicon, now Russia's foremost drone unit, and an absolute headache for the Ukrainians and force multiplier for the Russians. In 2026, though, it's the Ukrainians with the new defence minister, and with it, a surge in reform and innovation. By global defence standards, having been born in January 1991, Fedorov is young. He may in fact be one of the first millennials to lead a national defence ministry through a major conventional war. But he'd previously established himself as the head of Ukraine's Ministry for Digital Transformation, which in the context of the war in Ukraine was less about back-end IT services for government and more about spamming drones and new technical solutions the way we associate with the war in Ukraine. It's obviously too early to pass judgment on what Fedorov's entire time at the ministry will look like, but I think it's clear the Ukrainians currently have an edge in the frenetic pace of reform. They're shaking up the mobilisation, training and rotation system, put an enormous emphasis on drone procurement, and also scored some notable early wins. Fedorov, for example, is reportedly the one who engaged with Musk and SpaceX in order to set up the Ukrainian whitelist and effectively cut most Russians off from Starlink. Basically, if we simplify their struggle down to both maintaining the forces you have through an attritional war while also improving and adapting them as fast as possible, at the moment I think the data has a case for there being a bit less wind in Russia's force generation sails, while Ukraine has demonstrated some momentum on the technology and reform front. We'll talk about this more in the episode on economics, but suffice to say that compared to previous years, there have been massive leaps in Ukraine's mid- and long-range strike capability. The value of some of their technology and approaches has been acknowledged even by the Pentagon. And while Ukraine is still in the position of being reliant on military and financial support from its allies, it's also increasingly established itself on the world stage as a country with something to give when it comes to defence technology. We've seen the Ukrainians strike deals in the Middle East and set up multiple joint production and development agreements with the Europeans. And recently, it seemed like even some Ukrainian defence programs that raised questions in the past, like the Flamingo cruise missile, have been matured to start delivering some measurable results. What you're seeing on the right there, for example, is footage of the aftermath of an attack using both drones and Flamingo cruise missiles on a Russian factory about 1,000 kilometres from the Ukrainian border. That said, I just want to park the question of technology until a bit later in this episode, because first, I think it's important to make a comparison. It's all well and good to say that Russian casualties might be high and their force generation efforts might be shaky in places, but that doesn't necessarily tell you much in isolation. You need to keep in mind things like the status and trajectory of the Ukrainian force, for example, but also what the Russians are able to achieve with the force they have, which gets us the domain of lines on maps and what we can potentially derive from battlefield movements. Remember, as we've discussed in the past, we're coming into Ukraine's traditional campaign season. And going into 2026, there are reasons to suggest the Russians might have been, at least by the standards of this conflict, relatively optimistic. There are two respects in which I say that. Firstly, while the average rate of Russian advance in 2025 might still have made the Somme look like a sprint, it was, at least from a Russian perspective, less glacial than it had been in the past. The trend appeared to be in their direction, and while territorial changes at the rate we were seeing were far from likely to be decisive, the strategic risk for the Ukrainians might have come if the Russians were able to maintain that trend and pick up the pace. The Russians were also continually signalling diplomatically that they still believed their military would be able to achieve their territorial goals, especially in the Donbass. And some recent reporting suggests, although take anything coming out of the Russian rumour mill with a grain of salt, that, quote, Russia's top commanders have convinced Putin that their forces can seize the entirety of the Donbass by autumn, according to two people in contact with the Kremlin leader, two others familiar with the matter, and a Ukrainian intelligence assessment shared with the FT, end quote. It goes without saying this isn't the first time we've seen stories like this. You'll remember back in early 2025, Putin was talking about finally, quote, finishing off the Ukrainian military. But they're still the kind of things you'd expect to be hearing from a country that has the confidence born of battlefield momentum, not a force fighting a campaign where every push has a touch of Passchendaele about it. And yet, that's where the data seems to suggest we are. While the exact numbers vary between sources and what you define as controlled territory as opposed to a grey zone, the general consensus is, despite the weather getting better, the rate of Russian advance has pulled back. Deep State Map put the net Russian advance at 141 square kilometres in April, down from 445 square kilometres in December during the winter offensive, and also down from the equivalent period in 2025. Meanwhile, the ISW, which came up in last week's episode on prediction markets, actually assessed a net Russian loss last month, with 116 square kilometres less territory controlled by the Russians at the end of the month, albeit with the Ukrainians losing about 28 square kilometres on net thanks to a large expansion in the grey zone. As I said, we're less concerned here with the absolute numbers than we are with the pattern, and the observation that while you might expect the rate of Russian territorial gain to start picking up around this point, it's not. Or at least we haven't yet seen it pick up in the way you might expect based on the data from previous years. So what might potentially be going on here? Here's a non-exhaustive list of example explanations. It might be a case of incorrect reporting, Russia still advancing but not being reflected on the maps. It could be the rate of gain is lower because the intensity of the attacks is lower. Basically, Russia isn't spending as many resources and so isn't advancing as fast. Or it may be that they are spending the resources, are still attacking, they're just having less success moving forward. So let's start with the question of intensity first. Does the data suggest the Russians are just beating their head against a defensive wall, or are they just conserving their resources and biding their time? Based on what we've previously observed about this and other wars, there's a couple of indicators that might give us clues there. We know offensives for either side tend to spike casualties and show up in the other side's claims about their losses. We know there's often political and information warfare activity around major attacks, and on the assumption that forces generally won't want to bombard their own troops if they can avoid it, assumptions we can make about territorial advances based on where we can see all the explosions happening. Here, I want to bring in data published by Ukraine's Unmanned Systems Forces, both because the data is very extensive, the methodology is nominally consistent across months, and because at this point we have reason to believe the Ukrainian drone forces are accounting for a significant chunk of Russian casualties anyway. Remember, just as when we use Russian claim data, for this exercise to work, we don't need to assume the Ukrainians are being 100% accurate and truthful in the data they publish. We just need the methodology to be consistent across months so we can identify patterns. What you're seeing here is a chart splitting USF claimed inflicted Russian casualties, so both killed and wounded, split into 3 periods. November-December, so Russian winter offensive season, the January-February lull, and then March-April. As you can see, despite the Ukrainian drone forces continuing to expand, their number of claimed inflicted casualties dropped about 10% at the start of the year. I'd suggest that's broadly consistent with the drop-off in Russian offensive activity and there being fewer Russian personnel around to easily target. For March and April, though, the numbers were back above the November-December levels, meaning either the Ukrainian drone force has gotten significantly more effective, or target density and vulnerability is up again. If you look at most categories of claimed hits on Russian equipment, you'll see the same broad pattern. January, February saw fewer claimed Ukrainian drone hits on Russian armoured vehicles, and also the lighter civilian stuff like motorcycles and buggies. I deliberately decided to bring some of that light motorised equipment into the chart here because Russian offensives in 2025 and 2026 don't look like they used to in 22 or 23. You do see a lot of use of motorcycles and buggies for rotation or supply purposes, but they're also a key part of Russia's offensive mobility. And so you might now expect to see a spike in their losses during offensive periods, the same way you used to see spikes in APCs or IFVs. Back, when the largest tank force in the world was actually using tanks at scale at the front. Interestingly, there are a couple of equipment categories that buck the trend. Claimed USF hits on Russian SAM systems, for example, have just been on a continuous upward slope. Claimed hits in March-April were about 3.5 times what they were in November-December. And it was not just that, there was also an uptick in how damaging these strikes were claimed to be. In December, for example, of these 7 hits claimed, 0 resulted in the claimed destruction of the target, so mostly damage. In March-April, the destruction rate was closer to 25%. A lot of it might be going into that, but one explanation is a change in the type of drones the Ukrainians often use to attack those targets, including the employment of some larger drones with some more bang on board. Another factor might be that as the number of drones operating in these areas increases, the chance of another drone being able to survey the results of an attack and provide aftermath footage potentially goes up. So whereas before a crew might have been able to register a likely hit but not confirm a destroyed target, you might end up with more cases where the result now can be confirmed one way or the other. Another exception are claimed hits on Russian antennas and communications infrastructure, with one theory being this was tied to Russia losing access to Starlink. That robbed the Russians of an easy option for battlefield communications or the controller drones, and might have incentivized the Ukrainians to put even more emphasis on bullying whatever communications and network infrastructure they could find. Are they the most expensive targets on a modern battlefield? No. But their function, the logic might go, is invaluable. In summary then, from a Ukrainian perspective, it certainly seems like the Russians are pushing. And for their part, the Russian MOD continues to put out stories about Russian troops going on the offensive. What you'll see on the right there, for example, is a story credited to a commander in the 80th Tank Regiment, who describes the claimed process of fighting into a Ukrainian defensive position reinforced with concrete bunkers, anti-tank ditches, barbed wire, mines, and areas where the Ukrainians put up quote-unquote maximum resistance with the help of UAS. Summary, we can be relatively confident this might not be the peak of an offensive, but the Russians are on the offensive. Okay, so they're probably attacking. How do we validate the maps aren't misrepresenting the rate of advance then? Because to be fair, there is often a wide gap between what the Russian Ministry of Defense claims and what even some of the more pro-Russian maps publish. It's reported, for example, that in a recent speech by the chief of the Russian General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, we got a couple of choice examples of the war according to the Kremlin. So let's quickly overlay some of Gerasimov's claims with the obviously erroneous Deep State map. Deep State map has the limited Russian presence in Kupiansk in a difficult position. But according to Gerasimov, they're advancing from Kupiansk, which they've obviously taken, towards Shevchenkova to the west. Meanwhile, further to the north, battles are apparently actively ongoing in a town that, according to the map, is well beyond the current grey zone. According to Gerasimov, Liman is 85% under Russian control, with street battles ongoing. While 1st Tank Army apparently isn't just trying to fight towards the Oskar River, they've taken Borova. Although perhaps we shouldn't be surprised because last month, Gerasimov claimed that Russian forces had entered Borova. At that point, several kilometres beyond the assessed Russian front line, even according to one of the more pro-Russian sources. And so presumably if he hadn't announced the town had been captured soon, questions might have been asked about what Russian troops were doing there the entire time. The point is, these maps aren't perfect, and you can get competing claims. And the main question we have to ask here are the sources we commonly use potentially underestimating Russian advances? For that, there's a couple of geolocation approaches you might generally use in the open source. Geolocations of friendly troops in defensive positions, geolocations of losses, and the one I'm going to use today, geolocation of fires. This works because while a lot of weapons in Ukraine, from artillery shells to small drones, use relatively small warheads, some of the weapons used, especially glide bombs, so CABs for the Russians or JDAM and Hammer for the Ukrainians, can pack a lot more high explosive and tend to leave craters and evidence visible from space. That allows the creation of maps like the one you see on the right there, created by Clement Malin. What he's basically done is map Russian airstrikes in the Pokrovsk region with the colour indicating the timing. Those white dots are from May through October last year, while the red ones are more recent, I think February, March, April 2026. While, as you might expect, there are always some strikes happening behind the lines, especially clustered on those ground lines of communication, you do tend to get these large concentrations right near the front, and those move forward over time. Those might be associated with the use of glide bombs to try and blast apart defensive positions to enable the force to move forward. If we combine that assumption with another one, that the Russians won't generally be seeking to drop bombs on their own troops, we can fairly safely assume that anywhere being regularly bombed by the Ukrainians is probably under Russian control, or at the very least the grey zone, and so use it as a kind of proxy for battlefield positions. So if I demonstrate my top-tier artistic skills here by drawing a very rough line at the forward edge of those recent airstrikes, what you'll see is the correlation with the claimed grey zone and areas of Ukrainian control is pretty good. If the Russians secretly controlled a lot more territory than the maps suggest, then unless for some reason a bloke at the VKS really hates some of these frontline troops, you'd expect the bombs wouldn't be falling there and instead be directed further back at the Ukrainians. That's obviously not what we're seeing, which I think mostly kills the theory that these maps might be suppressing large-scale Russian advances, which I think leads us to potential explanation number 3. The Russians are trying to attack, but don't appear to be making a huge amount of ground at the moment, not because maps are hiding their advances, but because the fighting is just hard. In order to take the rest of Donetsk, the Russians now find themselves pushing against the so-called fortress belt. As you can see on the right there, they haven't really reached the main line of fortifications, nor the fortress cities of Slovyansk and Kramatorsk, and there are a lot of well-prepared fortifications between them and their stated territorial objectives. Part of the challenge here for the Russians is those fortifications and defensive positions, because over the course of the war, the Ukrainians have learned some hard lessons and changed their approach to defensive preparations. Whereas early in the war, you'd hear many cases of both sides pushing troops up into forward positions that hadn't really been prepared or maintained and then being told to dig themselves in, something which is obviously a bit of a challenge when you're working with hand tools and drones and artillery fire raining all around you. Some of the more recent Ukrainian approaches have been much more industrial. You start digging and preparing, often using civilian workforce and excavator equipment well behind the current front line. You prepare positions and you fortify it, and then you slowly dig your way forward. In safer areas further back, that might be largely civilian workforces with heavy equipment, preparing layer after layer of defences. Even further forward, it might mean regular troops and combat engineers digging in, sure, but with the benefit now of small excavators. Because while that kind of equipment might be spotted and destroyed by enemy drones, you can accomplish a lot more with an infantryman and a bobcat than you can with just an infantryman. As one Ukrainian put it, quotes, building a proper bunker for an infantry platoon takes 2 weeks and 8 people without an excavator, but with one, it takes about 3 days and 3 people, end quote. As the Russian MOD source mentioned earlier, some of these defensive lines now are less about trenches packed with infantry, as layers and layers of obstacles intended to constrain mobility. What you're seeing here is an example of the scale of what the Ukrainians have been trying to put together in the area. You have multiple wire lines to provide a barrier for infantry or light motorised troops like motorcycles. You have a line of dragon's teeth behind the wire, so if you use armour to breach the wire, they then face that problem, all coupled with a famously high-tech example of human defensive technology, the ditch. And of course, for good measure, all of this would be lightly dusted or not so lightly dusted with mines, including many of the approaches. For Russian forces who reach a Ukrainian line like this, moving through it, under the conditions of the war in Ukraine, isn't quite a military Kobayashi Maru, but it's going to be a pretty demanding and resource-intensive task. There are often deliberately gaps or breaches in the defences, especially around roads. But what that can do is channel attacking troops, especially light troops that can't breach the position anywhere else, into those known gaps, which become drone and artillery kill zones. There's some very graphic footage out there about what some of those areas look like, which I can't show on YouTube, but suffice to say, it does tend to channel the whole Siege of Rax experience. Another challenge is that standard doctrinal approaches to a defensive obstacle like this are just difficult to deploy under Ukrainian conditions. Conducting a combine arm breach through this thing, for example, would typically require a whole slew of armoured vehicles. You need to be able to deploy line charges to clear the mines, breach the wire, remove the obstacles, potentially bridge the ditches depending on the scale, and then create a corridor that troops can move through. But if you can't bring that armour forward safely because the sky is continuously buzzing, obviously you have a problem. With the extra complicating factor here being that if your rate of advance is sufficiently slow, because of all the fortifications, you run the risk of the enemy using the time you spend taking those positions to just build more fortifications behind them. If you can't advance quickly enough, or make the rear areas too dangerous for this kind of activity, you basically run the risk of your opponent just going into Minecraft mode. Meaning you can end up with a dynamic where it's not grind, breach into breakthrough, but instead grind, followed by another grind, followed by, would you believe it, yet another grind. Which links to a final factor I wanted to mention that might be working in Ukraine's favour here. The tendency of these Ukrainian defences to absorb a lot of Russia's advantage in fires. Russia, for example, has far more glide bombs than the Ukrainians do. But because they're the ones trying to go forward, they have to dedicate huge numbers of them to trying to slowly blast apart Ukrainian defensive positions one by one. Similarly, Russian artillery fire might be directed against Ukrainian defensive positions, while the Ukrainians can use more of their ammunition on exposed attacking troops in the open. Russian data also seems to suggest that even a lot of their smaller drones are being absorbed by things other than Ukrainian infantry targets. When Russia's Rubicon unit, for example, published claimed data on its 10,000th hit on a Ukrainian target, about 2/3 of those claimed hits were against one of three categories: Ukrainian drones, Ukrainian communications equipment, or Ukrainian fortifications and firing positions. Only 3.5% of attacks, by contrast, targeted Ukrainian soldiers. Compare that to broadly equivalent data put out by the Ukrainian USF and you can see the difference. Rubicon, which usually has to deal with a dug-in Ukrainian opponent on the defensive, reported fewer than 4% of their strikes against Ukrainian personnel. The rate for the Ukrainian USF has been pushing 8 times that, with more than a quarter of all claimed strikes being against Russian infantry or personnel. As for where a lot of the other strikes are going, the relationship when it came to targeting enemy quadrotors and copter drones was basically the inverse. Rubicon reported about a quarter of their hits against Ukrainian rotor drones. The Ukrainians only about 3% of theirs against Russian equivalents. Part of the question here might be a difference in policy or targeting priority, but part of it might also just relate to the different dynamics between attacker and defender. In summary then, the most recent battlefield movements might give the Ukrainians a couple of reasons for cautious optimism. The rate of advance seems to be low, drones in defensive positions are sponging up a lot of Russian fire, and it doesn't seem to be that the pace of Russian advances so far is for lack of trying. But I also think that case for optimism, which I've seen reported across a lot of media, needs to be tempered against a couple of other points. One, the Russians are still generally expected to advance, and over the last 6 months, they have succeeded in threatening or taking some significant positions. The loss of Seversk back in December, for example, was fairly notable. Secondly, we're still not in the traditional peak of the campaigning season. In 2025, June, July and August saw faster Russian advances than April or May. And in that respect, we're still working with very early data, and I'd argue that makes it far too soon to definitively call time on Russia's mid-year effort in 2026. And finally, while it's not the main topic of this episode, there is a side point to be made here about equipment losses. For most of this war, equipment losses followed a relatively simple pattern. Russia was generally on the offensive and losing a lot more heavy kit, think tanks, IFEs, self-propelled guns, than the Ukrainians were. Now, the situation is more nuanced. Claimed Russian personnel casualties are up, and you see huge numbers of light civilian vehicles like motorcycles, buggies and pickup trucks in the data, but it's now not uncommon in any given week for Ukraine to suffer more visually confirmed armoured vehicle losses than the Russians. Now, part of that, anecdotally, likely comes down to how both sides are now using their remaining heavy equipment. But I think the balance of the evidence so far is that if we take the Russian stated objectives as a given, and the goal here actually is to try and militarily seize the rest of the Donbass, then I'd argue there is very little in recent events to inspire confidence. And as for the idea that it can be accomplished this year, I think it's fairly safe to slam the press X to doubt button. And part of that might reflect the changing state of the technological tug-of-war at the forward edge of the battle area. This is a war where Russia and Ukraine have basically been racing each other to evolve their tactics, their techniques and their procedures. And in one aspect of that constant war of adaptation versus counter-adaptation, the data seems to suggest the Ukrainians might have been tugging particularly hard recently. Given this is a battlefield-centric video, I think it makes sense to start with one of the defining weapons of the war in Ukraine, which is the small drone, SUAS. While it's still a bit of a truism to say drones can't entirely replace people or entirely replace other weapon systems like artillery, in Ukraine it's also fair to say that all of those other systems combined couldn't entirely replace the drones. They now inflict or enable the vast majority of casualties. They're the main reason Ukraine has been able to get around munition shortages at various stages of the war. And they're absolutely central to the development of a phenomenon that helps explain why even a relatively sparsely manned Ukrainian frontline is still able to monitor, control and deny terrain. The kill zone as it's described in Ukraine, which has come to stretch further and further away from the frontline, really only exists and is enabled by the drone operators on both sides. And so you might characterise parts of the recent fighting through 2025 and into 2026 as really a battle for the shape of the kill zone. Does it stretch further behind the Russian or Ukrainian lines? How lethal is it at various distances? And how effective are both sides at jostling for dominance within it, going after each other's drone teams, for example? The idea of the kill zone might help explain why, even when Russia takes a hill, a town, a defensive position, and the geography suggests they might be able to push on, it still often turns into a costly and expensive slog. Because even if there are barely any or no Ukrainian troops in that open ground, you still have to cross it. The drones are still watching it, they can still mine it, they can call fires on it, and without concealment, or preferably hard cover like a basement, pushing through that terrain can still be a costly and incremental exercise. But even though the Russians and Ukrainians recognise the importance of the drone war and have continuously been trying to take the advantage in it, they've never adopted exactly the same approach. They've always had comparative strengths and weaknesses. Ukraine's drone innovation model, for example, with lots of private companies often dealing directly with different ministries or individual units and volunteer organisations, has often boiled down to semi-organised creative chaos. It's meant you have lots of different companies pushing out lots and lots and lots of different designs, and then you're relying on the units and market-based systems like the Brave One Marketplace to figure out what works and encourage that to scale. The downside of that approach is that while Ukraine might be able to generally innovate quicker, they often haven't enjoyed the same advantages of equipment standardization and mass production that the Russians have. The Russian system generally moves slower, but tends to select a couple of designs, and then scales up to pump those out as fast as possible. Log into the Ukrainian Brave One Marketplace, and you will find page after page after page of different FPV, bomber, and loitering munition designs. Meanwhile, you look at data released by Russia's Rubicon Group, covering 10,000 of its claimed strikes up to the end of October 2025, and you basically only have a handful of types. The VT-40 FPV, Molniers, VT-40s, KVNs, VT-40s, a couple of interceptor designs, and more VT-40s. The reason I bring this up is because it suggests that as a general pattern, if Russia hits on a winning design and concept and is given enough time, all else being equal, they might be able to pull the battlefield advantage in their direction, because they can just pump out more of the things. But if something disrupts the balance, or the Ukrainians find an edge or two, it can take them a while to catch up. In 2025 and going into 2026, I'd argue both sides had relative advantages in the battlefield drone war. Ukraine, for example, seems to have still had a major advantage in the use of heavier bomber drones, especially for nighttime operations, while the Russians were the first to introduce jam-proof fibre-optic guided FPVs at scale, and seem to have been quicker off the mark to scale their production. Then there were areas where the technical race was more contested, especially when it came to drones intended to operate further behind the lines. In 2026, though, there were a couple of developments that compounded together. Firstly, the Russians at least mostly lost access to Starlink, while Ukraine's access continued to grow, and with the availability of cheaper terminals, it became more and more practical as a control option for drones that might be operating at almost any distance. For Russian drone operators, that mattered in two main ways. It removed one of the cheapest and most accessible communications options they were using for some of their longer-range drones, and it also meant the drone teams themselves lost access to a valuable deployable communications tool. Basically, the advantage the Ukrainian drone forces already enjoyed when it came to this kind of satellite internet suddenly increased, while one of Russia's traditional drone war strengths got hit from a couple of unexpected directions and a few more expected ones. Fibre optic cable was used by both sides because it was resistant to electronic warfare, provided a high-quality picture, and in the grand scheme of things when it was first produced, wasn't that expensive as an advanced guidance option. As a result, the two countries started consuming an absolute shit ton of the stuff. According to one dataset, in 2022, Russia consumed about 0.6% of the global fibre optic cable supply. In 2025, 10.5%. Ukraine, meanwhile, went from a rounding error to about 5%, which I'm sure was all being used for civilian telecommunications purposes. Larger and larger coils came into use, with some of the longest I've seen for drone purposes topping out at around 50 kilometres. From the Russian perspective of trying to scale these things, though, two events then intervened. In April 2025, in an event I'm sure absolutely nobody saw coming, Ukraine attacked Russia's only fibre optic cable manufacturer. As you can see on the right there, the compulsory renovations to the site were non-negligible. And apparently repairs to the site must have been treated with the same urgency as many a government infrastructure project around the world, because it was recently reported, about a year after the strike, that the facility was still offline. Just 1 year of lost production would have translated into millions of kilometres of additional cable. And the disruption added one more small additional pressure on the already overwhelming reliance the Russians had on the world's greatest fibre optic cable producer, China. And like any good allies through 2025 and into 2026, a number of those Chinese manufacturers did the only thing they could do. They continued to supply Russia with the fibre optic cable it needed, but in some cases they took them to the absolute cleaners on pricing. Because remember, there's an AI boom on. Fibre optic FPVs now have to compete with the global build-out in data centres for a limited fibre optic supply, and in a bidding war with cashed-up tech firms, you can imagine the result. The soaring prices haven't put an end to fibre optic FPV production, far from it, but they've squeezed budgets and production rates in a way that arguably hurts the Russians more than the Ukrainians, who are no doubt using significant amounts of Chinese fibre optic cable, just like the Russians are, just not as much of it. There are also other areas of the battlefield drone war where Ukraine has arguably been faster off the developmental mark. Both sides have deployed uncrewed ground vehicles, for example, but especially early on, the approach they took wasn't the same. Russia started the war with a significant advantage in UGVs, but a lot of their interest was in the larger robo-tank style systems. Think robotic infantry fighting vehicle equivalents, and even a program for a converted remote-controlled T-72. Most of that stuff, however, hasn't really proven particularly useful in Ukraine. These units tend to be big and expensive enough that they're not attritable, and so while you might potentially preserve a crew by using them instead, they still face some of the same problems all other armoured vehicles have from the presence of things like small drones. The Ukrainians, meanwhile, have mostly focused on the smaller, cheaper, more attritable stuff. The Russians do have some designs in equivalent size categories, things like Courier, for example, but the simpler end of the spectrum is where the Ukrainians have put a lot of their effort. Fedorov's stated goal is to contract 25,000 UGVs in the first half of 2026, more than double the 2025 total, with the key focus on the Ukrainian side, even more than the Russians, pushing logistics tasks onto the UGVs. Part of the idea there is to reduce the number of personnel and regular vehicles moving through the kill zone, so that when you inevitably lose things doing regular resupply missions, at least it's a drone rather than a truck or a person. We've seen some of that emphasis already flow through at the front line, with cases of Ukrainian UGVs doing everything from taking Russian prisoners to, in one case, being used to evacuate this old woman from a dangerous frontline area, which would be difficult to safely or stealthily move through using a civilian van. Apparently, the operators laid down a blanket on the thing, reading "Grandma, sit down," and to her credit, the 77-year-old apparently took the advice and made it out. I doubt they let her keep the thing after the event, but you have to imagine it would make a heck of an impression if you ditched the walker or the scooter and instead rolled up to the shops on a military UGV. And while for the moment UGVs remain much, much rarer than flying drones of all kinds, what you're seeing here is a chart that suggests the Ukrainians might still have an edge in rolling them out. What I've done here is compare visually confirmed Russian and Ukrainian UGV losses across 3 time periods: October-November 25, December to January, February to March. The idea behind using loss rates here is that in order to lose something, you first have to be using it. And so all else being equal, we can potentially get away with using losses as a proxy for deployment. While I'd want several more months' data to be really confident here, what we do have had the Ukrainian loss figure about 4 times the Russian one back in October-November 2025. Then in December-January, that Ukrainian figure ramped up by more than 50%, but because the Russian figure in the same time period more than quadrupled, the relative ratio was now closer to 1.7 to 1. In February and March, however, something interesting happened to buck the trend. The Ukrainian number continued to increase, now about twice what it had been back in October-November, but the Russian figure collapsed by about 75%, widening the ratio to something like 8 to 1. There's a lot that could be going on here, and you'd expect the data in any given month to be a bit choppy. But given the coincidental correlation in timing, there might be a bit of Starlink syndrome going on here. One of the big challenges with UGVs compared to UAS is communication. UAS can sometimes struggle to maintain connection when they dive down to lower levels and find themselves amidst the clutter, but UGVs live in the clutter. There are a couple of ways to potentially deal with that problem. We have seen a significant number of Ukrainian teams and designs that leverage satellite internet, and after the introduction of the whitelist, the idea is they can continue to do so, while the Russians potentially have to look to other developmental options. That's not to say there aren't alternatives, there very much are, and some of them are already in use. But it seems possible that in the race to get these things rolled out effectively, the Russians hit a bit of a speed bump, while the Ukrainians have an opportunity to power ahead. The same may be true in other, potentially even more important aspects of drone warfare, the strikes that are well behind the front lines, but aren't exactly yeeting warheads out to the Urals. That's the important aspect of so-called mid-strike capabilities, and something we'll pick up in a future episode. But the broad takeaway is there's a couple of significant capability areas where we have seen a constant developmental tug-of-war back and forth between the Russians and Ukrainians, not just in terms of the technology itself, but also deployment and tactics, where recently it seems the Ukrainians at least have an opportunity to move the balance further in their direction. The Starlink shutdown certainly hasn't stopped Russian uncrewed system operations, but the data seems to suggest it has slowed their improvement in their scaling, and meant they have to pursue potentially second-best technical solutions while the Ukrainians can power ahead with something that works. As to how exactly the Ukrainians will attempt to leverage any advantage, and how the Russians will attempt to redress it, only the coming months will tell. Which starts to get into why, even if there's some good news for Ukraine here, I still think there's reason to be deeply cautious about what direction the balance will tilt in the future. The first is that in this war generally, when one side or the other has had an advantage in a particular area of innovation, it hasn't lasted forever. If you roll out something that works and the other side goes through the singularly unpleasant experience of having it work on them, the natural human response is to ask, where can I get one of those things, and roll out some of their own. Given the number of announcements and the amount of drone footage being published, that doesn't just apply to technical elements like the drones or the guidance systems, it also applies to organisation and tactics. This is something the commander of Ukraine's USF, Robert Borovdy or Magyar, has talked about publicly. He's described the Russians as seeing what Ukraine is able to do with its USF and essentially copying the model for its own. As he put it, quote, they're effectively copying the existing franchise of Ukraine's unmanned systems forces grouping, end quote. Whether you're talking about a military or civilian context, that kind of dynamic is often hard to avoid. To get ahead, a first mover has to develop something new. They have to test, they have to risk, and they're often going to have to refine. A second mover, though, can just watch all the would-be first movers experiment, make mistakes, and set the occasional pile of money on fire before they hit on something that works, and then just move to duplicate the winning technology or model, albeit with some time delay. It's not then safe to assume that Ukraine or Russia will maintain any leads either of them has in any technical area of this war. If they don't continue to innovate and adapt, the other side will inevitably catch up. So while the Ukrainian drone force might enjoy some momentum now, if they don't keep moving with Tony Stark and a cave levels of speed, then as they have in the past, the expectation should be that the Russians will close the gap. And without maintaining an advantage in tactics or technology, the Ukrainians in the longer run would run the risk of falling victim to Russian scale. But of this estimate is that the Russian unmanned systems forces are already 114,000 strong, and even if it comes at the expense of other parts of the force, are likely to hit the target of 168,000 by the end of 2026. And it absolutely has to be remembered that as that race is ongoing, Russia is capable of making innovations of its own. We regularly see upgraded systems released with new propulsion systems, new guidance, different warheads or different tactics intended to make things harder for the Ukrainians. So just keep in mind that in a war like this, any sort of technical advantage in the drone war is always going to be a point-in-time phenomenon. In any case, there's plenty more elements we could go into, but in the interest of time, if we zoom out a bit, where does all that leave us? As I said right at the start, swings in the narrative about a war can happen rapidly and dramatically. Part of that might be recency bias, but it also comes down to the reality of people and the media. If you were a news organisation, I can't imagine your click-throughs would be great if you ran a bunch of headlines saying, things today mostly the same as yesterday. So I think it's natural to the extent when you have something very public and obvious, like a Victory Day parade sadder even than the 2023 version, or Ukraine or Russia scoring a couple of wins in short order, to immediately extrapolate that into another case of the tide turning. What I'd argue is that things on the battlefield do shift, but they tend to do much more slowly and more incrementally. You don't get from accelerating Russian advances to a mostly stalled out battlefield overnight, and the advantage tends to pull slowly back and forth rather than yo-yo wildly. Based on what we've seen over the last couple of months then, I wouldn't jump to saying Ukraine is suddenly advantaged on the battlefield. What I do think we can say is there are a couple of factors that have moved in their direction. Outside the unmanned systems forces, force growth appears to be sluggish or negative. The Ukrainian edge in certain parts of the drone war appears to have escalated, and while there are many months of good campaign weather ahead, Russia would need to significantly pick up the pace just to match its 2025 tempo. None of those factors by themselves are necessarily decisive, and there's no guarantee they're going to be permanent. But that also doesn't mean they're irrelevant. It's notable that a country that was willing to spare units and equipment to parade in 2023 as they awaited a Ukrainian offensive didn't choose to do the same in 2026, citing the need for those resources elsewhere. It's notable that the gap between Russian claimed and evidenced advances is as wide or wider than ever, and it's noted that some key strategic threats to Ukraine that we identified in 2025, like the drop-off in American support, haven't, at least so far, translated to any kind of visible Russian momentum in 2026. There's still a huge number of unknowns here. How will the Ukrainians' own force generation efforts go in 2026? Who's likely to get the edge in future technical developments? And how are major global events outside the war likely to shift the balance? Just to name a few. In the near future, we'll look at some of the bigger picture strategic factors that remain relevant. Economic endurance, military production, public will, and the still incredibly rapid evolution of the mid- and long-range strike campaigns. But leaving all those factors aside, there may well be a couple of reasons for cautious Ukrainian optimism here. The Russians may remain generally resource advantaged, and the Ukrainian military tired, under strength, and stretched incredibly thin. There are places where the front line is fragile, and nothing can be taken for granted. But if you compare the present state to some of the projections back in 2025, the battlefield currently looks a lot different to the worst-case scenarios that were being projected for Ukraine at the time. And from a Russian perspective, if your strategy partly depends on projecting strength at home, abroad, and at the negotiating table, that might be comparatively harder to do. If your military's advance looks more snail than steamroller, and a public spectacle that's traditionally been an opportunity to show strength ends up becoming a news story for very different reasons. And okay, brief channel update to close out, because at this point my voice is going a bit. One of the great challenges with Ukraine is how difficult it can be getting all the potentially relevant data into a single episode. As I said earlier, the way I decided to deal with that this week is to essentially chop the topic into two, and so in the next couple of weeks expect to see a part 2, where we start doing similar analysis, but from more of an economic, political, and long-range strike perspective. But for now, I hope you found the look at the more battlefield side of things useful. There's very little in this war from an analytical perspective that's safe to take for granted, and I think it's fair to say the Ukrainians are still in a very challenging military position. But what's clear is that they're continuing to innovate, and as we cover today, I think there's reason to think that matters. As always, genuine thanks to all of you for your ongoing support and engagement, and with any luck, and it does take luck given the 2026 we've had to date, barring any major disruptive international events, I'll see you all again next week.